Welcome to this introductory video of the series of videos about the Vanhal concerto, double bass concerto. He is my colleague José Andrés Reyes from Venezuela.
Hello, Korneel.
I'm Korneel Le Compte from Brussels. We met last year, about last year.
Yes.
And we discovered we have a mutual interest in classical music, in Viennese tuning, Viennese double bass, etc. So this is the first video of a series of 3 videos, 1 video each for each movement of the concerto. So what do you know about the Viennese bass? The Viennese bass is basically a pretty normal double bass with some special features. It's got gut strings, it's got frets, it's tuned in a different way, in the way we call the Viennese tuning. And Viennese tuning is basically when you take the upper 4 strings, because some Viennese basses have 5 strings, but if you count the 4 upper strings, from low to high you have A, D, F sharp, A. So that's the basic tuning, and then the 5th string has a tuning which can vary between F natural and a low D. This is your basic instrument. It's tuned to a D major chord. And José Andrés has a little bit of experience with the instrument, but not all that much. But the great thing when I first heard you is you played on a normal bass, and when I closed my eyes it sounded like a Viennese bass. I don't know how you did that. So it made me wonder if I really need to use a Viennese bass for Viennese classical music.
Well, I thought it was me asking the question, so can
You can
ask you a question?
Of course you can.
Why Viennese tuning?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why?
Oh, first of all, when Viennese
Yeah.
tuning? If you wanted to explain this to bass players out there, when was it used and
The Viennese, yes. Viennese tuning is the tuning that was used by bass players during, let's say, what we call now the classical period. So roughly from about 1750 until the beginning of the 19th century. And strangely enough, during those, let's say, 2 generations, the instrument went through an evolution, going from basic, simple, triadic music to quite complicated and quite difficult virtuoso pieces, mainly by the main Viennese bass player, Johann Matthias Sperger. Some of his pieces are really technically quite demanding, and he was the guy who, within the limits of this D major tuning, he tried to get out of these limits, and he tried different tonalities. He tried to tune the bass up, even going to F major, and he took it to its limits. And when the Viennese bass reached the limits of the possibilities, when we come to the Romantic period, then composers went to different tonalities and different sound aesthetic, and the Viennese bass didn't fit in anymore. So it was gradually abandoned. And we have a period of the time frame of about 50, 60 years where the Viennese double bass was the main double bass instrument in the territory, in the Viennese territory, which was quite extended throughout Eastern Europe. But the strange thing is that actually the Viennese tuning wasn't used in other parts of Germany or in other parts of Europe. It was very local, actually. It was a local tuning. And now we can take the train, we can take the plane. Back then you had to take a carriage, a horse and carriage. And so it could happen that in a certain region, a certain way of playing was maintained over quite a long period of time without any great influence from anywhere else.
Talking about the instrument and how it was built specifically, if I went outside of Vienna some years before this era of the Viennese bass, I would find the same instrument, I mean the same shape. So a big instrument, a big violin doing the 16-foot function. They were tuned differently. Maybe they had different set of strings they had, and then if I went to Vienna, I would find the same shape of the same instrument, but tuned in this specific tuning in D major. This is this correct?
Yeah, that's interesting, because if you talk about shape, actually the Viennese bass, the Viennese classical bass, is instantly recognizable because it's got a very specific shape. It's got this what they call in German Wappenform, like a shield. An upside down shield. So it's got sloping shoulders, it's got no violin corners, the sides and the top and back are flush, there's no overhang of the front and the back. And the headstock is very typical, with the little notches in the back and the front, as you can see in the pictures we're showing you. And maybe the main difference, apart from the tuning, is the fact that basically the Viennese bass had 5 strings, and in other countries basses could have 3 strings or 4 strings, but Viennese basses basically always had 5 strings until the later period, when some of them went back to 4 strings instead of 5, because in the solo pieces the 5th string wasn't actually used. So the shape is quite different. It's a very typical Viennese instrument, which you can't mistake for anything else. And in other countries you had all kinds of shapes and sizes and forms, kind of violin-shaped double basses. You don't find them in Vienna. So you have only have these very slender, narrow, long basses. Long also in the string length, because the average string length of a Viennese bass is something like 110 centimeters, which is quite long by today's standards.
Should we call it the Viennese bass, the Viennese
Violone, yes,
D
yes.
Violone?
Well, D Violone. Musical terms, names for instruments are always a bit delicate, because, for instance, even later on when you look at Schubert's scores, he calls the same instrument contrabbasso or violone, even within the same piece. He writes 2 movements for, let's say, contrabbasso or for violone, and the 3rd movement he says violone. So we should always be a bit reluctant to use these terms randomly. Even Sperger too, he calls his instrument contrabbasso or a double bass or a violone. So we're not really sure if that means if that was a different instrument. I don't think it was a different instrument. It was just a confusion of terms. I think we shouldn't really believe that a violone is always a 16-foot instrument, or a basso means a double bass. Basso could mean a cello, could mean all kinds of things. So there's a lot of confusion there. So yes, we can call this a Viennese violone, or a Viennese double bass, or a contrabbasso, whatever you feel like.
And it is D major. It
Yes.
is tuned in D major.
Basically, the tuning is in D major. Originally, it seems the very early form of the bass was actually in D minor with an F natural, and then it changed to an F sharp. So this means that, for instance, in the solo literature, of course, the easiest tonality is D major, because you have the open strings, you have the harmonics, and it sounds really wonderful. You can go to A major, you can go to G major, it's still feasible. You can't really go much further than that without giving up the specific qualities of the instrument. Of course, you can play in any key on the Viennese bass, but you lose the resonant qualities of it. You don't have the harmonics, you don't have the open strings that you have in D major. So for me, the Viennese bass is more interesting as a solo instrument than as an ensemble instrument. As an ensemble instrument, as long as you stay in the simple keys of D major, A, G, etc., it's wonderful. But as soon as you go to E flat major, or the strange keys or keys that were far away from D major, it kind of loses its qualities, its specific qualities. So it doesn't make much sense, to my mind, to use it as an ensemble instrument for just all the pieces of that period. So I mainly use it as a solo instrument, and I hardly ever use it in an ensemble.
And since you're talking using it as a solo instrument. We have the famous bass concerts of that time, the Dietersorf and Vanhal and the Hofmeister concerts. They were written in D major. They are performed in E flat major.
Yes.
Can you? We play them maybe in C, maybe in D, maybe in E,
yes.
or.
In order to have a bit more variety in tonalities, what the composers did was just tune up the bass a semitone or a tone to E flat or to E major, and like I said in Sperger's case, even in one case to F major. So just tune the bass up completely instead of trying to figure out how to play in E flat major. They just retune the bass. And of course, when we play these pieces now, we can't really do the same thing. We can't play them the same way because we don't have the triadic tuning, we don't have the D major, we have tuning in fourths, uniform fourths. So there's a lot of things we can't really do on a modern bass or we can't imitate. And then we have to choose which tonality will suit the piece the best. And that's why we have editions of the Vanhal and Dietersorf and of a lot of concertos in in C or in D, depending how you're going to use the modern bass to its best advantage. For instance, if you use a modern bass, you can figure that you have an open A and an open D, so D major could be nice, but you're missing the open A string, the top A string, which is quite important. So in that case, you have to try and find out which is the best way to arrange the piece. Most of the concerti are quite difficult to play on a modern bass. Some of them are easier, some of them are downright impossible. So I never saw the interest of playing Viennese music on a modern bass. And very early on I thought it's much better to use the original tuning and to get this original sound and the ease of playing and the aesthetic qualities of this music with a Viennese bass instead of a modern bass.
So the question is, this is the answer to the question, why Viennese bass in 2018 and
yes,
for
yes.
you?
Yes, it goes further than that. Using the original instrument, at the start I used a modern bass and I just retuned it for Viennese tuning. I took off the E string and I changed strings, and I used a solo tuning A string for the top string. And no frets, steel strings, and already it sounded like a completely different instrument. It was a totally new sound world. And I think this too, the fact that you have a completely different experience of sound and of resonance is so inspiring. It's not just because it's easier, it's because it inspires you. It gives a different sound. And then when I went to gut strings and frets, of course the effect was even bigger. And you learn how to use the bow on gut strings, how to play with gut strings. We come back to gut strings later on. Gut strings require a very different approach with the bow. So this is all very inspiring, and you play in a different way musically, and you find a different emotion in the music. And the good thing about using these ancient things, these ancient methods and instruments, is that actually it's very beneficial for your modern playing as well. That's the great thing about it. And I would suggest and encourage bass players to really try these ancient tunings and gut strings and everything, just in order to feel a different way of playing, a different emotion, a different quality that they can use on the modern instrument as well. You will be more sensitive, you will have more bow control, you will make different colors, which you probably wouldn't have discovered without the ancient instrument.
What did you learn about the music, about Vanhal's and Dietersorf and Sperger's or Mozart's music, by playing the instrument that pieces were actually written for? Which insights did the instrument give you to the music? Going
to the field of ancient music, maybe I have to explain how it came about, how it happened. The first time I tried Viennese tuning was when, I think in '86, one of the singers at the opera asked me if I could play Mozart's Per questa bella mano. And I had heard the piece a couple of times on a modern bass, and I said, yeah, sure, because I wanted to play it. I had never played it before. And okay, I said yes, so I had to do it. And then I started thinking, and I had this Planiowski Geschichte des Kontrabasses, where he talks, the book about the double bass, where he talks about this ancient tuning for the bass and especially for this aria. So I thought, instead of trying it on a modern bass, because I'd heard it a couple of times and I was never convinced of the playing or of the difficulties, it seemed very clumsy on a modern bass. So I'd retuned.
Also very difficult.
Very difficult. It looked very difficult and it sounded very difficult, and frankly it didn't sound very good. So I retuned my bass, and I just basically played around with the tuning for a couple of days, and then I started practicing the piece. So that's how I started Viennese tuning. And afterwards I played everything, every Viennese concerto that I had to play, Vanhal Dittersdorf, I played in Viennese tuning. The wonderful thing about going back 200 years in music is that you discover so much more than you bargained for. You start to discover manuscripts, you see how composers notate the music. You have lots of questions because manuscripts are not like printed music, they're not always clear. You don't always see what does this articulation mean, how many notes are under the slur, what does this mean, what's this dot. So there's a lot of questions when you look at the manuscripts, and you learn so much from them. And one of the most important things I learned is actually that the music is not in the manuscript, the music is not in the printed text, because ancient composers wrote roughly, let's say, 50% of the result they wanted to hear. The performer had to do the half of the work. So you can't just play exactly what's written, because it sounds awful if you have no knowledge. So I started.
The composer also knew.
The composer,
of course.
Exactly. The composer knew that the performer would do half of the work. He just wrote down the notes and very basic indications, and he knew that the performer was going to do his part of the job, and if he had a question, he could ask the composer. We can't do that anymore. So that's a very interesting side effect of starting with the Viennese tuning, that little by little I started to understand how composers write their pieces, how the performer is very important in the creation of the piece. So yeah, it's a very enriching experience. Instead of just buying modern editions and playing exactly what's written on a modern bass, which is kind of a lazy approach to music, it's a lot more hard work when you go to the ancient instrument and you have to figure it out for yourself, actually. And I went back to conservatory at the ripe old age of 50. I went back to conservatory, to the ancient music department, and I studied ancient music, so I knew I could learn from some experts and masters how to look at this music. And actually, instead of giving me a lot of answers, they gave me a lot more questions, which I found very stimulating.
So what you see is not what you get, no, with this.
No, what you see in the score, is not what you should get. If you play exactly what's written in the score, it's for sure it's not going to resemble anything like what the composer wanted to hear. That I'm sure about. What he wanted to hear, we don't really know either. But there's no straight answer that if you play exactly what's in the score, then it's going to be okay. It's not.
So a dot is not.
A dot is not a dot.
A dot.
No, we learned these definitions. I remember some of them I still know in the exact words, the definitions of all these musical terms, what a dot does, and a dot after a note, and a dot and a slur, what all these things mean theoretically. But we forget that all these symbols, all these notations, they're different in every period, they're different in every country, They're different from city to city, different from one period to the next. Even within a career, a composer's career, he's going to use the same symbols for something different, in a different way. So there's not one clear answer. What does a dot mean? Does it mean that the note is shorter? Not necessarily. A dot can be a long note. It can just mean that the note is separated from the next note, but it's not necessarily a short note. So your whole world comes crashing down. Everything you learned before is uncertain, so you have lots of questions, and you have to start looking for answers in the scores, in the treatises, in the how do you say, concert reviews of the time back then. There's a lot of information, pictures, paintings. You have to find information everywhere you can. But it's kind of, in the beginning you're kind of lost, because we learned to trust the score and play the score, and then we've done our job and that's it. And actually that's just the beginning. That's maybe the 5% of the beginning, and all the rest you have to figure out.
So if I were to start playing the Vanhal concerto, the details of concerto, for the first time, or if I met someone that was to begin to play these pieces, should I start by looking at the manuscript, or is that too deep for me in 2018? To just the first contact that I have with this music is the original manuscript. Would you advise that? Should I start with a modern edition?
Tough question.
Is it too much information that I will, or too little information that I will get from?
Yeah, too much and too little at the same time, actually. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, you've played it so, and I've played it from a modern edition before I started with the manuscript.
But not only that, also Bottesini concerti.
Yes.
You can look at the manuscript.
I think absolutely any musician whose worth is salt should, I think, try to see the manuscript, or to see a copy of the manuscript, and do this research, at least to have a look at it, because there's so much that's available now on the internet and in the libraries. You can find it with very little effort. There's so much. The manuscript of the Vanhal concerto is on the internet. You can, if you want to see it, just 2 clicks away and you have it. So there's no excuse not to. And yes, at the same time you have very little information, because again you only have the notes and the symbols, and a lot of questions, because, as I said, the articulations don't seem to be very clear. They are clear, but you have to know how to read them. And so there's not enough information for you to know how to play it. You have, as I said, you have to do the research. You have to read. You have to read the treatises of the period, Quantz and Leopold Mozart and others, and you have to go very deep. At the same time, of course, there's a lot of information there, because the great thing about a manuscript, like for instance Vanhal or Sperger's music, is that you're actually looking at the same image that people 200 years ago were looking at, which is a magical experience. You're looking at the same thing. He played from this, probably. Maybe he played it by heart, but anyway, he wrote it, and he saw the same thing, which is a really fantastic experience. So I would advise anybody to always go to the source, if it's available, to try and find it, and to see for yourself, for instance, all the differences between the manuscript and the editions. And sometimes you just can't believe how editions are made, on what basis decisions are made to change things that are clearly in the manuscript, and then you see something completely different. And sometimes it's because the editor has his own idea of how it should be, and sometimes it's also because the editor misread things, which happens very often in, I'll come back to that, in, for instance, Sperger scores. If you know how he notates articulations, then it's all clear. But if you don't get it, if you don't understand the system, you make big mistakes. So I would always do a mixture of things. I would see the manuscript, but that's not enough. I would also get information about the period. I would also, for instance, because you asked a question about Vanhal, I would not listen to 20 double bass versions of the concerto. I would rather listen to Vanhal symphonies and church music, etc., and get inspiration from that. And I would also listen to contemporaries of Vanhal, of course, and listen to general pieces, music around the concerto, but not just do the research on 20 versions of the Vanhal concerto, which will very often have the same weaknesses and the same mistakes and the same errors in interpretation of the manuscript. So I think it's important to widen your field of vision a bit and to include many more things.
Also because what we know now as the modern editions for these concerts are really translations of this music for the fourth tuning.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
The modern double bass.
Yes, that's you can call that translations, exactly. And sometimes, of course, you have to change things because they're impossible on the modern bass. But sometimes things are changed for no apparent reason. And like I said, sometimes it's just misreading the score, misinterpreting what's in the score. It's very human and it happens all the time. So if you really want to get as close as possible to the music, of course, I think it's interesting to take the original instrument, or at least the original tuning. That's for sure. If you want to play it on a modern bass, you can, but even then I would get as much information as possible about ancient music, about the way of playing. And of course you can play in a very convincing way on a modern instrument. You can play in a very historical way on a modern instrument. It's not that the historical instruments are absolutely imperative in order to have this classical or Baroque aesthetic. You can do that on a modern instrument. I'm absolutely convinced it's possible. But what makes it easier for me is the fact that I went to the ancient instruments like the violone and the viola da gamba and the Viennese bass, etc., and then I transposed all this feedback you get from the instrument and from the bows and from the strings, and then you transpose that to the modern instrument and you have a different sensitivity. And then I think you can really convincingly play in that style on a modern instrument. So it's not as clear-cut as that you can only play ancient music on a so-called ancient instrument and you can't do it on a modern instrument. That's not true. You can do it. You can come really close to it. It won't be 100%, but it won't be 100% with the ancient instrument either, because we don't know how it sounded. We have no recordings of 200 years ago.
Because you don't live 200 years ago.
We don't live 200 years ago, so we have no idea. Basically, what I learned in the ancient music department is we know nothing. We don't know anything for sure, or very little. We know a couple of things for sure, but a lot of it is speculation, is educated guesses, with the accent on educated. You can't just guess, but you have some information that lets you guess, and maybe you're in the ballpark and maybe not. But your chances increase if you have more information. You have a better chance of being close to what it could have sounded like. On the other hand, but this is a philosophical discussion, of course, we can never, even if we get it really right as it was before, if by some means we can really know that this is how they played, we can't hear it the same way that people heard it 200, 300 years ago. We have airplanes, we have trains, we have trucks, and we have noise, we have a very different soundscape. We live differently, we think differently, we feel differently, we have music all the time. You have music on the radio, on the television, you go shopping, you have music. That's a very different life. So the impact of the piece, even if it's played exactly the same way as it was 300 years ago, the impact on the listener will be completely different. So you won't have the same thing. Even if it's the same thing, it won't be the same thing. So this, only to say that this search for authenticity is something that's quite defective, actually, because authenticity doesn't really exist. You can't get it, and even if you get it, it doesn't have the same effect on the people now that it had back then. So what's the point?